In the summer of 1087, within the stone walls of a monastery in Rouen, a stench so unbearable filled the air that even the most faithful attendants fled in horror. The source of the odor was not death, but the decaying body of a living king. William the Conqueror, the mighty Duke of Normandy and ruler of England, whose once formidable frame was now rotting from within. The man who had reshaped kingdoms through conquest and command was dying a grotesque death that chroniclers would recount for centuries. His demise began not in the heat of battle, but from a tragic accident born of wounded pride. At 59, William led a campaign against the French town of Monty, after King Philip I of France mocked his obesity, comparing him to a pregnant woman. Enraged, William vowed vengeance and set the town ablaze, riding triumphantly through the inferno on his warhorse. But as fate would have it, his horse suddenly reared, whether startled or burned remains uncertain, and the king was thrown violently against the iron pommel of his saddle. The blow pierced his abdomen, tearing internal organs. Though he showed no external wound, William felt a deep and terrible injury within. Carried in agony to Rouen, he endured torturous days of medieval treatments, bloodletting, poultices, and desperate prayers, all to no avail. His abdomen swelled monstrously, blackened with infection, and soon emitted a stench so vile that even his most devoted attendants could not remain near him. The conqueror of England, the terror of Europe, was consumed by his own decaying flesh, dying not on the battlefield, but in putrid misery, a grim and unforgettable end to one of history's most powerful kings. The smell that filled the monastery was that of decay, of flesh decomposing while life still lingered within. It spread from William the Conqueror's chamber through every corridor, saturating the air with the reek of death. Come too soon, servants gagged and retched as they entered the room, pressing vinegar-soaked cloths to their faces in futile attempts to block the putrid odor. Each day the infection advanced, consuming William's body from the inside out. His skin turned grey and mottled with black patches where the tissue had died, and his once robust face shriveled into a gaunt mask of pain. His cries echoed through the monastery. The king who had once commanded armies now begged for release from his torment. The conqueror of England, who had spent his life fighting and ruling with iron will, was powerless against the rot that devoured him. Bacteria, indifferent to power or pride, reduced the great monarch to a suffering mortal. In fleeting moments of clarity, William wept not from agony, but from the bitter recognition that he, who had conquered kingdoms, was now conquered by his own body. As his condition worsened, his loyal servants began to desert him, unable to withstand the stench or the horror of his decay. Even those who remained were soon driven by greed rather than duty. News of the dying king's condition spread, and opportunists descended upon his chamber. Gold, jewels and relics that had once symbolized his triumphs were plundered as he lay helpless. Orderic Vitalis, the chronicler, described the appalling scene of men stepping over William's festering body to seize his treasures, some even laughing as they did so. The conqueror, who had ruled through fear and strength, was reduced to a pitiful figure, stripped of dignity and possessions alike. Yet amid betrayal and decay, William turned to faith. A lifelong believer, he sought forgiveness for the blood and conquest that had defined him, confessing his sins to priests and monks who performed his last rites. In those final days, the once mighty king found himself utterly alone, his empire slipping away, his body failing, and his spirit clinging only to the hope of divine mercy. Even the priests who came to comfort William the Conqueror could barely endure the foul air of his chamber. They hurried through their prayers and blessings, fleeing gasping for clean air. In his final confessions, William confronted the violent legacy of his reign, admitting to the countless deaths he had caused, the destruction of towns, and the brutal suppression of uprisings. He expressed deep remorse for the harrying of the North, the devastating campaign he had ordered in 1069 to crush English resistance, a scorched earth policy that led to famine and the deaths of nearly 100,000 people. He also lamented his fractured relationship with his eldest son, Robert Cathose, whose defiance had once driven them to battle. As he faced death, William arranged his succession. Robert would inherit Normandy, William Rufus would take England, and his youngest, Henry, would receive money decisions that would later sow discord among his sons. By late summer, William's body had become a grotesque spectacle. His abdomen swelled monstrously, his skin stretched thin and discolored, and the smell of decay became so overpowering that even standing near the monastery was unbearable. Chroniclers wrote that the stench carried into the courtyard, and that birds avoided flying overhead. Finally, on September 9, 1087 at dawn, as the bells of Rouen Cathedral rang for morning prayers, William stirred one last time, murmured a prayer to the Virgin Mary, and died. After weeks of torment, death came almost gently, but what followed was anything but peaceful. The remaining attendants fled the moment life left his body, abandoning the corpse in the sweltering summer heat. Left unattended for hours, William's remains decomposed rapidly, filling the air with a stench that drove everyone away. When attempts were made to prepare him for burial, even the embalmers recoiled in horror. The body was too far gone, bloated, discolored, and falling apart at the touch. A local knight named Herluin finally agreed for payment to arrange the funeral that no one else dared to oversee. He ordered the corpse hastily wrapped in wine and spice-soaked cloths and placed in a lead-lined coffin to contain the smell. The process was gruesome. Those who handled the body reported that pieces of flesh came away in their hands. When at last the coffin was sealed, William's remains were transported from Rouen to Caen, where he had requested burial in the Abbey of Saint-Étienne. What was meant to be a solemn royal procession instead became a desperate effort to outrun decay, a final pitiful journey for the once mighty conqueror of England. The coffin bearing William the Conqueror's bloated corpse was placed on a wagon and covered with a pall, yet the stench could not be contained. As the funeral procession moved through the Norman countryside, peasants and townspeople who had gathered to mourn were driven back, gagging and covering their faces. Chroniclers wrote that some threw flowers toward the passing wagon, not out of reverence, but in a desperate attempt to mask the smell. Dogs that approached would howl and flee. When the procession reached Caen, tragedy struck again. A fire had broken out in the town, delaying the funeral for hours. The lead-lined coffin sat in the blazing summer heat as decomposition accelerated inside it. Gases built up, swelling the corpse further until the pressure within the coffin grew dangerously high. By the time the ceremony began at the Abbey of Saint-Étienne, the church was filled with nobles, bishops, and clergy who had come to honor their king despite whispers of the body's condition. The church was solemnly adorned, prayers prepared, and the stone sarcophagus awaited before the altar. Yet the moment the coffin entered, dignity gave way to dread. Even through the lead lining, the odor leaked, filling the church. As the pallbearers carried the coffin down the aisle, the assembled mourners began coughing and covering their faces. Some stepped back, pale with disgust. Still, the priests pressed on with the funeral rites. When the time came to transfer William's remains from the coffin to the sarcophagus, the horror reached its peak. As the lid was pried open, the stench exploded into the enclosed space, instantly overwhelming the congregation. People gagged, vomited, and fled for the doors, but the pallbearers, bound by duty, struggled to complete their task. The problem was soon evident. The sarcophagus, crafted years earlier when William had been leaner, was too small for his swollen, decomposing body. They pushed and forced, trying to fit the massive corpse inside. Then, with a sickening sound, the bloated abdomen ruptured. The gases and putrid fluids burst forth, filling the church with a stench so vile that chroniclers compared it to the opening of hell itself. Orderic Vitalis later wrote that the air seemed thick with the stench, like a dark cloud rolling through the sanctuary. Nobles and priests fled in panic, trampling one another in their haste. The royal funeral dissolved into chaos, vomit, screaming, and horror replacing solemn prayer. Only a few priests remained, faces buried in their vestments, desperately burning incense, and pouring perfumes to fight the unbearable odor. The body, now barely intact, was hastily shoved into the sarcophagus, though it still did not fit properly. The decision was made to seal the tomb immediately. Stonemasons were called to close it with mortar and stone slabs, working in short shifts as the suffocating smell drove them repeatedly outside for air. Thus ended the burial of William the Conqueror, the great king who had reshaped nations, laid low by decay and humiliation, his final ceremony collapsing into horror and stench. The funeral of William the Conqueror ended in hurried disgrace rather than royal dignity. Priests, choking on the foul air, rushed through their prayers from as far away as possible, eager to be done with the nightmare. There were no eulogies, no grand ceremony to commemorate the ruler who had conquered England and reshaped Europe. The service that should have been a solemn tribute became infamous for the grotesque tussle of a corpse that had literally burst before the eyes of nobles and clergy. Word of the horror spread swiftly through Normandy and England, capturing the morbid imagination of all classes. Within weeks, peasants and lords alike whispered of how the mighty king's body had exploded in church, how the mourners had fled in panic, and how his burial had been completed in chaos and shame. In a time when funeral rites were sacred and seen as reflections of divine favor, William's degradation was viewed as a clear sign of God's judgment. To the medieval mind, his revolting death was no accident, but retribution for a life of violence and pride. Preachers and chroniclers seized upon the tale as a divine morality lesson. They declared that the conqueror, who had lived by the sword, ordering the slaughter of thousands, burning towns and ruling through terror, was punished in death by the corruption of his own flesh. The symbolism was undeniable. A king who had commanded armies could not command his own body. A ruler who possessed untold wealth died, stripped and robbed. A man who had once inspired awe ended his days provoking only disgust. His fate embodied the medieval belief in the fleeting nature of earthly power and the ultimate supremacy of divine justice. The harrying of the North was often cited as the sin that sealed his damnation, its atrocities too great for even his pious works to atone for. The humiliation of William's burial also had lasting political consequences. His son, William Rufus, who inherited the English throne, was so appalled by the tales of his father's funeral that he distanced himself from Normandy, leaving the duchy to his brother Robert. The division deepened tensions within the royal family and foreshadowed years of fraternal strife. Meanwhile, William's tomb in the Abbey of Saint Etienne at Caen never became a true royal shrine. Pilgrims came, but the place carried an air of unease rather than reverence. The story of the bursting corpse lingered too vividly in memory, turning the site into one of grim fascination rather than pious devotion. Over the centuries, the tomb suffered repeated disturbances, as if cursed by the shame of its beginning. When it was reopened in 1522 during renovations, chroniclers found little more than scattered bones, a fitting echo of the disorder and decay that had marked both William's death and his uneasy legacy. In 1562, during the French Wars of Religion, William the Conqueror's tomb met the same fate as his decaying body centuries earlier: complete destruction. Calvinist soldiers ransacked the Abbey of Saint Etienne in Caen, shattering his resting place and scattering his remains. Only a single thigh bone was reportedly rescued by a monk, later placed in a new coffin when the abbey was restored. A 19th-century monument now marks the site, but it contains only that lone fragment. The man who had once claimed 2 kingdoms and reshaped a nation now rests as little more than a relic, a fittingly fragmented legacy for a body and empire that both fell into ruin. Modern medicine allows us to understand the grim reality behind William's agonizing death. The impact from his saddle likely ruptured his intestines and possibly his liver or spleen, spilling bacteria into his abdomen and causing peritonitis, a lethal infection of the abdominal lining. Without antibiotics or surgical intervention, the infection rapidly produced swelling, inflammation, and gangrene. Gas-forming bacteria caused his body to bloat grotesquely, while toxins released compounds such as putrescine and cadaverine, responsible for the unbearable stench of decay. William's obesity worsened everything. His poor circulation allowed infection to spread, and his abundant tissue provided ideal conditions for bacterial growth. By the time of his funeral, decomposition and gas buildup made the rupture of his abdomen almost inevitable. Today, physicians could have easily saved him: antibiotics to kill the infection, surgery to repair the rupture, and drainage to prevent sepsis. But in the 11th century, such remedies did not exist. His doctors, helpless in the face of unseen enemies, could only watch as their king rotted alive. For William, a man defined by strength, control, and conquest, the psychological torment must have been unbearable. His body, once a symbol of power, became his executioner. There is a universal terror in such a death, the horror of being betrayed by one's own flesh. It is this primal fear that gives his story such lasting resonance. Across the centuries, William's end has fascinated not only for its grotesque detail, but for what it reveals about human frailty. He had subdued nations, built castles, transformed England's language and law, and established a dynasty, but none of that mattered against the smallest of foes. His armies could not conquer bacteria, his castles offered no defense against infection. His power and pride meant nothing to the decay consuming him. In the end, the man who conquered England was conquered by his own mortality. Whether seen as divine judgment by medieval chroniclers or as a reminder of biological vulnerability by modern readers, William's death endures as a haunting testament to a timeless truth. No matter how great our achievements, we remain fragile beings of flesh and blood, destined to fall before the inexorable forces of nature and time. The horror of William the Conqueror's death was deepened by the abandonment and betrayal he endured in his final days. At the height of his suffering, when he was most vulnerable, those who had once served and feared him turned away. His attendants fled from the stench of his decaying body, his possessions were stolen before he even drew his last breath, and his funeral descended into chaos. There was a complete collapse of human decency and dignity in both his death and burial. The theft of his treasures was especially symbolic. The gold, jewels, and silks taken from his chamber were not mere valuables, but tangible representations of his power and triumphs. To have them stripped away as he lay helpless was a cruel confirmation that his authority had vanished, that even before he was dead, he was already defeated. The grotesque spectacle of his funeral only compounded this humiliation. Instead of the grand ceremony meant to honor a monarch and affirm the continuity of kingship, it became a scene of panic and revulsion, his corpse bursting before horrified witnesses, his legacy drowned in stench and disgrace. For those who witnessed William's death, the trauma must have been immense. Nobles who had fought beside him, priests who had served his court, and servants who had attended his household were forced to confront the most disturbing sight imaginable: their powerful king reduced to a decomposing carcass. It shattered their understanding of authority and mortality alike. For the clergy, the scene provoked troubling spiritual questions. Was this divine punishment for William's sins, or simply the cruelty of nature? Could confession and last rites redeem such a man? Or was this agony a foretaste of eternal judgment? Even among the common people, the story stirred conflicting emotions. For those who had suffered under William's harsh rule, especially the victims of the Harrying of the North, where tens of thousands perished through famine and fire, his rotting death seemed like divine justice, a fitting end for a tyrant who had ruled through fear. Yet even his enemies were disturbed by the indignity of his treatment. In a society that revered proper burial as a sacred duty, the sight or even the thought of a king decomposing unattended was a moral outrage, a sign that the natural order itself had been violated. As the tale spread across England and Normandy, it evolved into a moral fable, passed down in sermons, chronicles, and oral storytelling. It warned of the dangers of pride and the limits of earthly power, illustrating that no conquest or wealth could spare a man from decay. Parents repeated it to their children, priests used it to admonish the proud, and nobles took it as a sobering reminder of their own mortality. Chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis and William of Malmesbury preserved every grisly detail, not out of mere sensationalism, but because they recognized the death's moral and historical weight. Their vivid accounts ensured that nearly a millennium later, the story still endures with extraordinary clarity. William's death has since become one of the most infamous in royal history, rivaling any for its horror and degradation. Modern biographers and filmmakers continue to return to it, drawn by its haunting combination of physical decay, moral symbolism, and tragic irony. Though William's military genius and political legacy were monumental, it is his ghastly death that lingers most vividly in public memory. For many, he is remembered less as the conqueror of England than as the king who died rotting alive and whose body exploded before his mourners, a brutal reminder that even the mightiest ruler cannot escape the ultimate power of death and decay. The death of William the Conqueror continues to fascinate because it touches something primal within the human psyche. We are drawn to horror, especially when it topples the mighty. There is a strange satisfaction, perhaps a yearning for justice, or a dark curiosity in watching the powerful brought low by forces beyond their control. William's rotting death embodies this paradox, both tragic and grotesque. It reveals the fragile humanity behind his monumental power. Modern medicine only deepens the horror, allowing us to imagine the bacterial invasion within his body, the ruptured organs, the spreading infection, the gases that swelled him until his flesh burst. Knowledge makes it no less terrifying, it simply renders the suffering more tangible. William's end was neither noble nor peaceful. It was a slow, excruciating decay, marked by abandonment, betrayal, and humiliation, a death that stripped away every illusion of control or grandeur. The conqueror who had remade England and Europe was undone not by sword or rebellion, but by infection and time. The body that had carried him through battle became his tormentor, his flesh rebelling against him as his power slipped away. His story reminds us that no achievement, no crown can shield us from the inevitability of decay. Thrones offer no protection against peritonitis. Empires cannot defeat gangrene. Beyond the medical and physical horror lies an equally devastating social truth. William's servants fled, his treasures were stolen, and his funeral dissolved into chaos. The relationships built on power and fear evaporated when that power failed. Loyalty, it turned out, was conditional. Even kings discover that devotion cannot be bought when death approaches. Yet amid the ruin, there remained flickers of humanity. William's confessions, his remorse and his yearning for divine forgiveness show a man stripped of pretense, confronting his own fragility. His suffering was, in the end, deeply human, a reflection of universal fears, pain, loss, and helplessness. His death was not merely one kind of horror, but many. It was medical horror, as his body decomposed while he still lived. Social horror, as loyalty turned to opportunism. Existential horror, as power gave way to powerlessness. And spiritual horror, as faith wrestled with guilt and fear. Together, these layers form one of history's most haunting narratives, a story of greatness undone by mortality. Nearly 1,000 years later, the tale of William's end still grips us. We recoil from the details, yet cannot look away. The stench, the bursting corpse, the fleeing mourners, all remain as vivid in our imaginations as they were in the chronicler's accounts. The story endures because it speaks to truths that never fade, that power is temporary, that the body is frail, and that death humbles all. William's legacy is immense. The Domesday Book, the Norman castles, the transformation of England's language and governance. But beside those triumphs stands the grotesque reminder of his end. History remembers both the ruler and the ruin, the conqueror and the conquered. In life, William reshaped nations. In death, he revealed the limits of all human ambition. His story endures not only as a record of conquest, but as a meditation on mortality, a warning that no matter how high we rise, we are all, in the end, flesh destined to fall.